Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Resource Center for Public Sociology event series on racial equality, racial equity, Indigenous knowledges, and research ethics. Our talk today is entitled Learning About Research Ethics That Start with Community, and we will hear from two members of the Finch Community Research Partnership who will be introduced to you shortly. I'm Ann Kim, a faculty member in sociology and current director of the center. I'd like to begin by recognizing that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the Resource Center for Public Sociology and the Department of Sociology in York University. The RCPS acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. The language and sentiment on sharing and caring seem especially pertinent these days as we witness the recent violence in Nova Scotia and the death of Joyce Echaquan. For these types of recent and ongoing events that challenge taken for granted beliefs that we have achieved universal civil rights and racial equity, particularly for Black and Indigenous peoples across Canada, we are focusing this year's workshops and events around the interrelated themes of racial equity, Indigenous knowledges, and research ethics. This country's official discourse as a multicultural nation belies the entrenched systemic and institutionalized Eurocentric ideology that persists in education, the justice system, labor markets and the economy, healthcare, research, and that structures our day-to-day lives and interactions. Public sociology has an important role to play in mapping such inequities and in confronting dominant ideas, assumptions, and practices in scholarship and in everyday lives. With this aim, this year's RCPS workshops join broader dialogues and calls to action. Before I turn to Professor Lorna Irwin, who will introduce today's speakers, Talisha Ramsaroop and Shenali Dawn, I'd like to announce our next two events. A conversation with Professor Claire Jean Kim, University of California, Irvine, on her upcoming book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, on 12th of November at 1 p.m. And our second event, Ethnographic Praxis, Reflections on Ethics, Boundaries, and Social Change in Research with Rohingyas by Dr. Ishrat Sultana from the North-South University in Bangladesh and recent graduate of our doctoral program, which will be on the 24th of November at 1 p.m. Please note that today's event is now being live streamed on YouTube and recorded and linked on Facebook. This means that you and your background may be visible to others, which is simply an alert, as personally, I like seeing children and pets who help to alleviate some of this Zoom fatigue. As for questions after the presentation, please submit them via the chat function in Zoom. If you signed into YouTube on a Google account, you should be able to write questions in the comment section, and we will try to get there as well, but we are still getting used to this system, so bear with us. And now I'll turn to Professor Irwin for the introductions.
Thank you, Anne. It's a very exciting competition. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Talisha and Shenali. This partnership I've had an association for a long time, and in the poster it says 2016, but I'm sure they'll tell you that it's been happening for a long time, directly to community concerns, community demands that our neighborhood, the York University neighborhood, that research conducted there is both by and for and with the repository and the ethical review are very much a part of that. I'd also like to say a little bit about both Talisha and Shenali in sociology at York. Her thesis was based in the Black Creek Jane Finch community. She has worked for as long as I've known her on multiple projects that are community-based. She's currently the coordinator of the TD Community Engagement Center, and she's the project lead with the Jane Finch Community Partnership. She won't have time to list them, and she is the award holder of many, many recognitions of community leadership. Shenali is currently a York student. She's the research community coordinator on the Jane Finch Community Partnership. She too has a history of involvement in our neighboring community and involvement in student associations. So I think this is one of those presentations where you're going to hear people that have been deeply involved from the beginning, that really walk the walk and talk the talk of community engagement. And both the project and the individual we're going to be listening today exemplify commitment to community. Community engagement is driven by community, and finding ways to work so both the university and the community are enrich these partnerships. And I will turn it to our guests. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Lorna. We're really excited to be here today to be talking about the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership, which is something Shenali and I have both been working on for a while now. So we're really excited to share a little bit about the work that we've been doing, what we've kind of got done up to date, and our hopes for the future. So as Lorna introduced us, my name is Talisha, and then Shenali is my co-presenter today. And we're going to give you guys a very brief understanding of the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. And I say brief because this work has been happening for over 5 years now. The Jane Finch Community Research Partnership has existed for 4 years, but the work on creating more ethical relationships between Jane Finch and the community has been happening for as long as I can remember. So an hour is surely not enough to really capture all of the complexities and the different conversations that we've been having, but we're going to try to get as much as we can covered today.
So just before we begin, I just want to quickly go through a land acknowledgement. The community that is now known as the Jane and Finch community has been inhabited for generations beyond our knowing. We recognize the historical territory of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit Indigenous peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampun Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this region is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including many survivors and intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the legacy of the residential school system.
Okay, so before we get started about what the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership is, we wanted to give you guys a little bit of a community background. So when we're talking about research within the Jane Finch community, there is historical relationships that has existed. Specifically within Jane Finch, there's been this historical relationship that has existed with York University as well as other institutions. Because York's proximity is so close to the community, there's been an intensified relationship between York and the community. One that has existed for, as I mentioned earlier, as long as I can remember. And the relationship has always been a relationship of tension. So if we think about the Jane Finch community and York University, there's been this feeling by many community members that the relationship has not been mutually beneficial. And when I talk about the relationship, I'm talking about the overall relationship in terms of the way that placement students interact with the community, the way research is done in the community, the way faculty members engage with the community. So there's been this feeling that the community has kind of not having the same benefits that the university gets. And this relationship has been intensified when we talk about research, because for many community residents, there's this idea that the Jane Finch community has been over-researched by York University specifically. And this is very, very closely linked to the stigmatization that exists within the Jane Finch community. We know that Jane Finch is exotified. We know that it's stigmatized. We know that because it has a higher population of racialized folks, of new immigrants, of people living with poverty, of young people, it tends to be a hot spot for research. There becomes this notion that if you can do research in Jane Finch, you've kind of made it in academia, or if you can do research in that community, you know, there's that savior complex that comes in as well. So there's been a lot of folks who have wanted to do research in the, unfortunately, the way that research was done was not traditionally done in a mutually beneficial or even a meaningful way. Research was kind of done in a way that was very much so parachuting, where we saw researchers parachute into the community, do this research, and then parachute back out without creating long-term relationships or setting any types of roots in the community. There's also been this feeling that even when people were doing research in the community, they were doing it in a very stigmatized notion. So people were either reinforcing stigma. So we had a lot of folks that, you know, would do research and kind of repeat those same notions of Jane Finch that we hear a lot of the times in mainstream media or in general conversations. So notions of violence, gang, deviance, would get repeated in the academic literature that was being created. Residents spoke about things like the petting zoo effect, so feeling like they were animals that researchers would come in to pet or to, you know, engage with in not traditional and not well ways. So there hasn't been, I'll say there hasn't been a great relationship when it comes to research between the community and university. And so in 2013, this work kind of started with a group called the Connect the Dots Collective. And so they brought a bunch of people together for a symposium. This included residents, community stakeholders, as well as some really important people at York University to have a conversation about how we can better the relationship, the overall relationship between York University and the community. So they were really focused on improving the relationship in general, not so much focused on the research, but the overall relationship in terms of, you know, improving the relationship with placement students, with faculty members. And they had a series of recommendations that came out of this symposium. One of the ones that was related to research was to have a community resident sit on the York Research Ethics Board. We realized that this wasn't sustainable very soon because it didn't make sense for us to put a community person on the York Ethics Board to review all of the ethics proposals, even when they weren't about the community. It just wasn't sustainable. So we realized that, you know, even though it sounded like a great idea, when we thought a little bit more about it, it wasn't going to work the way we needed it to. In 2016, we actually developed this work more comprehensively into the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. And the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership is very hyper-focused on the research relationship. And in 2016, we kind of established two main goals for us. One was around creating a community ethics principles and protocol, and then the other was about creating an online community repository to increase access to research. This work has kind of, it was being done very informally by a couple key community residents who are just kind of doing this work on a volunteer basis or on the side of their table. So just because of their passion for improving research relationships between the community and the university. But in 2019, so last year, we got a SHRP grant to really work more meaningfully on this project. And so from last year, October, which is about a year ago, we've been working on really solidifying some of these key pieces.
Yeah, so just to get into, just to kind of add on to that and talk about who we actually are. So the partnership is made out of community residents, stakeholders, and nonprofit organizations and York University partners. And as Talisha mentioned, we were created in 2016 just to, as a result of the ongoing engagement between the members of Jane Finch and as well as York University. And then like the work has since then been focused on creating community procedures for reviewing and improving research in the Jane Finch community, as well as the collections and the ethics, and just having information more readily available for the community members. And yeah, so we'll go into the project goals later. And just to add on to that, we are, so yeah, so sorry, my apologies. So yeah, so our goal was to address these relationships just because of all the stereotypes that have been placed within the community, as well as in relation to York. Just an example that kind of like had me by surprise when I first heard of it was when students were coming into York, they were told during Frosh and during orientations, they were told not to cross the Shoreham Bridge that connects to Jane and Finch. So this was a big thing, that there was clearly no relationship between the community and York. So this was what was need to be worked on.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to add on to Shenali's point, those historical relationships is what we're trying to address with this work. And we saw those relationships play out in research as well, because we saw a lot of residents who, there was over researching. People were speaking about being part of interview processes like 3 times a month, right? Being constantly asked to do surveys, constantly asked to take part of interviews and focus groups because of this exotification of the community that existed. But then a lot of folks were talking about like being part of an interview and being asked questions like, how much times a day do you hear gunshots? Or how many people in your family have been murdered? And just like really reinforcing that stigma that Shenali just kind of talked about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our project goals. So we've kind of divided our goals into 3 pieces. The first thing that we need to do, or that we're working to do, is to create a community ethics process. So what our long-term goal is to do is to create our own Jane Finch Community Advisory Board that will be able to review research proposals for folks hoping to do research within the Jane Finch community. So our board is going to be community-based, and it's really going to oversee and support research proposals. So not only are we asking researchers to attain ethics from their institutions, we're asking folks who are looking to do research in Jane Finch to go through our ethics board to really check in with us if you're planning to do research within the community, and submit your proposal to our own community-led research advisory board. Another thing that we're hoping to do is really push out community developed resources. So for the past couple of years, we've been working on designing and facilitating 2 key resources. The first is a document that's entitled The Principles for Conducting Research in the Jane Finch Community. And this document has kind of been, I feel like I've been working on it for 4 years. So it's kind of like this, it's like a child that's been cultivated for 4 years, because it's a document that is about 30 pages long, but was really done in a very community collaborative process. So every time we had a draft, we went back to the community, got feedback. But what we were able to create as a result of this was this really rich document that talked about 7 key principles for how we hope researchers will engage with the community, with the Jane Finch community. So it's kind of like 7 principles for doing research within the Jane Finch community that we hope researchers will abide with when they're coming into the community. In addition to that, the other resource we're creating is an online module, so actually an online class that researchers can take to give them a better understanding before they come into the community. And then our last goal is to establish a Jane Finch research collection. So this is intended to be an extensive open access database that contains easily discoverable research about the community. This collection we're hoping that it's going to be freely available to community members as well as researchers, and it's going to be open access. We're still figuring out what platform we are going to use for this open access platform, but we are exploring using York Space or developing our own platform. So those are our 3 goals.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of a backstory, the co-lead of the project, in addition to Talisha, is Abena, and in the past, Abena walked into the CEC during her PhD and was looking for the research on Jane and Finch, and that's when it was realized that, oh, we have a lot of research that is being done in Jane and Finch, but the residents don't have access to this research. So then came objective 1, which was to establish the Jane Finch Research Collections, an extensive open access database containing easily discoverable research about the community. So how we went about this was to host a series of community meetings and workshops to connect with community, get input, as well as promote awareness, as well as connecting with York. And it was important, we need to gather materials for collections, as well as build a platform, which is what we are working on currently, as well as creating a module that shows how the collections work.
Yeah. And so the idea is that once this collection is done, it's going to be this online platform that hosts all of that research that's been done about Jane Finch that we know exists, but that residents don't have access to it unless they're a York University student or they're a student with an institution, because they don't have membership to those academic journals, right? So this will make that research that's been done about the community accessible for community residents, so they can now access that research, but use it. I mean, there's so many nonprofits in our community. There's so much activism that happens in our community. that for some of us, this research would be helpful when we're looking at educational attainment. Having access to research that has looked at educational attainment in the Jane Finch community would be extremely helpful to a lot of our nonprofits or our grassroots residents who are doing this work, but never are able to access this research because it's on JSTOR or it's on this, academic journal article publication that we don't have access to. So the idea is that this objective one will help residents access that research and use it to create change within the community. Objective 2, which I talked about a little bit, is about creating a community ethics process, which includes that community-based advisory board, as well as community developed training for researchers. We are actually almost done this objective. So for the past 2 years, we've been doing multiple community consultations. As I mentioned earlier, that principles document was created through a series of over 30 meetings with community residents and stakeholders to co-design and co-author that document. So we did a series of consultations for that one. We are also now working on those modules, which again, we did community consultation, and each of those modules is actually led by a community resident. So for example, there's a module on authorship and accountability, and that's led by 2 community residents who are skilled in that topic and who are taking the lead on developing that module, but also facilitating it. So we've done community consultations. We've worked on developing that training. And we are hopefully going to, over the next couple months, start working on establishing that Jane Finch Research Advisory Board and start developing the processes for this board.
So the principles for conducting research in Jane and Finch, this is the principles document that Talisha has been working on for many years. And the principles in this document are intended to be used as a guide to support and strengthen the research relationships between academic institutions, researchers, students, community members, basically everyone. And the principles summarize the expectations that we're looking for regarding respectful and ethical behavior by researchers who work in the community, just to ensure that all the research involving the members from the Jane and Finch community gives respect to the community members' perspectives, their knowledge, their values. So I'll just quickly mention the 7 principles, and then we will be going into them deeply in the next few slides. So the first one is respect for the Jane and Finch community. Then it's respect for community members, concern for well-being, commitment to justice, accountability, research outcomes, and complaint process and risk.
All right, so we wanted to break down these principles a little bit more. So the first principle is respect for community, and that's broken down into three key pieces. So the first is understanding the community, and this is really this idea that we're hoping that researchers hoping to do research in the Jane Finch community will take a step back and really take a minute to learn about the community. So rather than just coming into the community, having read a couple academic journals and knowing what you know, really committing to understanding the community, understanding its dynamics. And we understand that takes a lot of time, and we know that a lot of folks are working on a tight timeline, but based on that historical relationship that has existed between Jane Finch and the community, we are really emphasizing that in order to do research in the community, you need to have an understanding of the community that's holistic, that goes beyond the very one-sided stories that we hear in the media, and that you're really making that effort to understand the community in a holistic way. And one of the things we advise for this is to read the principles document, but also we really, really hope that researchers will take the modules, because the modules do a really great job of breaking down various different community histories, different community dynamics, those kinds of things. So we're really hoping that if you respect the community, you're going to take the time to really learn about the community in a holistic way and make sure you have a full understanding of the community before you come into the community to do research. The second part of this is building relationships with the community. And again, we understand that for a lot of researchers, we're working on a maybe 2-year master's, or you're on a tight deadline. But we cannot have this parachuting notion anymore. It's existed for a very long time. It's not working, and residents are the ones who are being harmed the most by it. So really emphasizing that if you're looking to do research in the Jane Finch community, you commit to building relationships with the community. It's not enough to come in, do your research, and then leave. What's your long-term plan? What's your impact of this research once you're done it? Who are you building relationships with the community? How are you building connections? How are you making sure that this research works to benefit the community in the long term? So really committing to building those relationships and creating some sort of roots within the community, as opposed to just hopping in, doing your research and hopping out. And then the last piece, which is kind of interlinked with that, is around knowledge mobilization. And again, this kind of links with this idea of having, this collections, because it's one thing to have research with communities like Jane Finch, where we know that there's multiple structural forms of oppression that exist within the community. We need to be able to mobilize that research. So what are our plans for knowledge mobilization? Are we creating this plan that talks about knowledge mobilization before we start research, during the research process, and after the research process is done? And are we making sure that our knowledge mobilization plans are suited for the Jane Finch community? Because what might work in knowledge mobilization somewhere else may not work in our community. So knowledge mobilization is really about making sure that your research comes back to the community. It's accessible to the community, rather that's through putting it on the collections that we're going to have, but also making it in clear, plain language, or making versions that are clear, plain language. We've talked about tabling at the local malls once your research is done, just having a table and talking about it at the local malls. One really cool project that did a really great job of knowledge mobilization was a group called Grow Our Grassways. And I like to use this example because I think it really takes account community dynamics. So Grow Our Grassways was doing work on the relocation of 108 families in the Jane Finch community through Toronto Community Housing. And this process was done in a very unethical way. It was basically gentrification, pushing residents out. So what Grow Our Grassways did was they did a photo voice series of residents documenting their experiences with relocation. But their knowledge mobilization plan was really unique because they actually set up an art exhibition with those photo voices in Jane Finch Mall, which is one of our major malls where a lot of residents go to. So they set up an art exhibition right in the middle of the mall, left it there for 2 weeks, and then did a panel discussion in the mall talking about those things. So really making sure that your knowledge mobilization is there and that it is it's something that works for community.
Yes, so the next principle would be community members. So the first part of this is upholding free and informed consent. So you might be wondering what consent means in research. So this means that participants must be made aware that they have a right to control the information they have provided. This means that anytime they can withdraw the information they've given, change, anything like that. So this also includes the right to not be identified and to restrict access to the information they have given, even after giving the information. So the participants should also be given the opportunity to review, modify, or direct any quotes that were used in the research. And it's the researcher's responsibility to make clear what steps the participants should be taking and what steps will be followed. So the next part of this would be respectful interactions with community members. So researchers will respect the community members' time and knowledge and will acknowledge and fairly compensate the members for their contributions to the research. In addition, the rights, interests, and diversities of all participants will be respected and valued. So the third part would be anti-oppression. So what this means is that researchers have to be aware of the history of vulnerability and marginalization in the Jane Finch community, and to take the responsibility to not cause harm, just because the community has had a really complex history, as Talisha mentioned before, and it's important to understand this history prior to coming in and doing this research. And as I mentioned before, compensation is also important, as the members of the community are giving their time and knowledge, so they should be fairly compensated for the contributions that they have made to this research.
Our third principle is concern for well-being. And concern for well-being is really about having a commitment to do no harm, which I know is already a fundamental part of research ethics, but we're really asking you to think about the various different harms that residents may experience in their everyday lives, and thinking about those different harms and making sure that we're engaging with a commitment to not enforce those harmful experiences. And again, this can be linked to stigma, making sure that we're not using stigmatizing language in our research. It can be, making sure that we're not re-traumatizing residents, just really doing our efforts to commit that we're not going to cause any harm. The second part of this is participant perspective. And this is just based on the idea that Jane Finch, although when it's talked about in the mainstream media, it's seen as this very monolithic community. The community is actually very diverse, and somebody from Jane and Shepherd will have a very different experience from somebody from Jane and Shoreham. And anybody who's worked in the community knows that there's so much different diverse experiences and perspectives. The participant perspective is just about making sure that we're taking account to the various different perspectives, and we're not leaving out any specific perspectives because it doesn't abide by what we thought we would hear or what we had assumed was already happening in the community. So being really conscious of the different perspectives that exist in the community and making sure that we're accounting for those perspectives. The third piece of this is confidentiality, and similar to informed consent, it's something that is 100% built into research ethics as it is. Why we are emphasizing it here is because the Jane Finch community is a very close-knit community. So people know each other. Shenali and I are working on this project, but I knew her when she was in grade 10, right? There's a very close-knit relationship that exists in the community. So when we're doing research with folks, we need to make sure that we are making an additional effort to make sure we're upholding confidentiality. Because if I say, for example, say I use a pseudonym, and I say a young woman who has been involved in various community organizations and does a lot of activism on food justice, a resident might be able to pick up exactly who that is, just because, like I said, the community is very close-knit. So when we're doing research on vulnerable topics, like, for example, police carding, which was a research project that we did a couple of years ago, we need to make sure we're really protecting the confidentiality of those folks because it can cause a lot of harm for them. So confidentiality is a very key piece in this work as well.
So the next part of this is commitment to justice. So the three parts of this is equitable treatment, no discrimination, and power. So what equitable treatment means is that all people that are impacted by the research will be treated with respect and concern in an equitable manner. So this means being intentional and reflective throughout the research process. For no discrimination, this means that individuals or groups will not be excluded from research for reasons that are unrelated to the research. So this means, this could mean anything. This could mean gender, race, ethnicity, age, disability, and more. For power, this means just considering the power imbalances that in a researcher participant relationship. So automatically there's kind of already that set power imbalance by a researcher coming in to interview a community member. So just acknowledging that imbalance and working with the community members to mitigate these imbalances between themselves and the participants, between individuals and participants, and the groups which they belong. So yeah, the researchers are expected to be reflective in their research process to ensure accountability.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add a little bit on that power piece. It's definitely something that should be emphasized because of that historical relationship that's existed, but there's lots of ways that we can kind of help mitigate that power relationship that exists with community members and researchers. And when we talked about informed consent a little bit earlier, that's a really easy way to mitigate that. So it's one thing to have a resident sign a consent form, is another thing to constantly reinforce that consent. So as the interview is going, letting them know through just saying, do you still feel comfortable talking about this? Do you still feel comfortable sharing this? In community meetings, if you're doing community consultations the way that we've done them in the past, we start every single community meeting by saying, are folks still feeling good about working on this process? It's really important for us to acknowledge that the community residents are the knowledge holders and they're the experts. And just making sure that we're being aware of that and really reinforcing them. We talk a little about co-authorship. That's a really cool way to help mitigate that power dynamic as well. If you're working with a community resident, can they be listed as an author, as a co-author on the document as well? So there's lots of different ways to kind of do this work. Our fifth principle is accountability. And this is just, for us, it's really just making sure that you're accountable to the community. And this starts with acknowledging that you read, reflected on, and have an understanding of this principles document. So in order to be accountable to the community, a lot of the different things we talked about in this principles document are pieces of that. So are you being accountable in the sense that you're making sure that community is aware of your research once you're done doing your research? Are you being accountable to the community by making sure that residents feel like they've had a say in this research? So just thinking through accountability, but also being accountable to this principles document or to this process, and making sure that you're constantly reflecting about how you have upheld these principles. The sixth principle we have is research outcomes. So our hope is that research should make a positive contribution to the Jane Finch community. So it's really a researcher's responsibility to ensure that participants understand the aim and the outcomes of the research and have heard the research results.
So next one would be process and risk. So this means that the participants will have the right to complain or appeal to the York University Office of Research Ethics should any problems occur during the research process. And the role of the Jane Finch Research Advisor Group is to protect the community members from any potential harms related to participation in academic research and facilitate accountability in academic research focused on the community, so academic research is respectful, just, and beneficial to the community. So again, this is just to make sure that everything is going well, and if there are any issues, they have a place to go to that we can just kind of jump in and help assist this.
So that is kind of a very brief understanding of the principles document. But if you remember, the principles document is just one of two pieces that is intended to be a resource for researchers. So it's intended to be kind of like a learning or a resource piece that researchers can engage with. The other part of that piece is the online module. So we are working on creating 8 online modules as part of like this online class that researchers can take, and that we are really advising researchers to take before they come into the community to do research. So I wanted to talk briefly about these modules. So the first module is really focused on an overview of the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. So it talks a little bit about who we are, why we started doing this work, a little bit about the historical relationship that is existed with research in the community. The second module is breaking down all the principles. So we've just kind of gone through them in a very brief sense, but the second module will kind of go through them in depth, talking about how to engage with these principles, how to enact them. We also have a module that's focused on the history of the Jane Finch community, because we feel like knowing this history is such a key piece of doing your research within the community. So this history really talks about the racialization of poverty. It talks about Indigenous populations in the Jane Finch community. It talks about various structural forms of oppression that have existed in the community, postal code discrimination, a couple different things that kind of lay the framework of the Jane Finch area. We also very intentionally created a module on the story of resistance, activism, and knowledge production within the community. And that piece is really about reframing the way that the Jane Finch community is seen based on what residents experience in the community. So talking about all of the resistance, all of the activism, and all of the knowledge production that happens within the community that often gets neglected. We have a module on authorship and accountability, which is really about how to do co-authorship and accountability work when we're working with residents. We have one that's focused on knowledge mobilization and talking about some case studies of really great knowledge mobilization within the community. We're breaking down what knowledge mobilization is, ways to do it, and examples of how it's been done in the community. We have one module that talks all about the Jane Finch community collections, because we know that that is a big piece of the work we're doing. It's great to have an advisory board, it's great to have resources, but if that research doesn't come back to the community, we're not having the same level of impact. So one module will talk about the collections, how to use it, how to find documents on the research collections, and the importance of that collections. And then our last module that researchers will take once they're done completing the other modules is a reflection on doing research in the Jane Finch community, which is really an interactive module that takes researchers through a reflective experience, based on what they've learned in the other modules, based on what they now know. What is their positionality? Has that research been done before? Really making them reflect on their own positionality and their research as they move forward. So these are the 3 key pieces of the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership: the collections, the ethics group, and that research, or those resources that we're hoping to create for researchers, or that we are already creating for researchers. So that is a very brief overview of the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. We do have a website, and our website is where that Jane Finch Principles document is hosted. So if you're looking to read more about that Principles document, you can check out the website. The modules will be on there by mid-2021. We also have an email if folks are interested in chatting with us, and we are trying to get more active on social media. So we are getting there on Instagram, but still working on it on Twitter and Facebook. So those are ways to kind of keep connected to us. But I saw the chat box going up a little bit, so I think now we have some time for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's a great overview of the initiative and the process to follow. And I think a lot of those principles we can carry with us in working with other kinds of communities as well. So thank you so much for that. We'll turn to questions. If you are on Zoom, please type in your questions in the chat and I can read them. I can read them out. I thought that we could also take questions on the YouTube channel, but I noticed now that it's been disabled and I've been trying to figure out how to get comments back up on it. But it seems that if our content is suitable for children, then then they automatically shut off the comments. So, so we'll see if we can adjust that for the next one. Okay.
So, Anne, I have some questions that were sent privately to me that I can kind of read and respond to.
Okay.
So one of them is, do you know when this document will be readily available? So the principles document, I've just pasted the link to it. So that is available. The modules will be available hopefully by next March. We're hoping that that's going to be ready. And then part of the question is, will there be restrictions on who has access to it? So the modules is going to be open to all residents. The principles is open to everybody, but the modules, we are going to be asking a pay-as-you-can fee for researchers. So we're going to be having a code that researchers can, contribute if they have any funds to contribute, and that funds will go back to supporting the advisory, because we're going to have residents on that research advisory group that's going to be reviewing proposals, and we want to make sure that those residents are compensated. So for folks who do end up taking the modules, who are researchers and who do have funds that they can contribute to that, those funds will then go into supporting the residents who are sitting on that Jane Finch advisory and really reviewing proposals and making recommendations and connecting researchers. I don't know why I'm getting a lot of private messages, private chat, so I'll read them out loud if it works.
Okay, I am getting a few as well, so maybe we can sort of go back and forth.
Okay.
But if possible, let me just ask people, participants, to send it to me privately, and then we can kind of make sure that we go in order. Or you can send it out to everybody. But and just so that we can sort of manage the questions and ensure and allow Talisha to sort of respond to the questions and think about her responses and Shenali as well, and not have to manage the questions, if that's okay.
Okay. Sorry, excuse me, and it's just that if you're using your mobile phone, and I'm not sure whether it's on computer, it only gives you access to the individuals, not a everyone group chat.
Okay, can you send it to me directly then?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, Talisha.
Okay, so I'll just take the next one and then I'll hand it over to you, Kim. I have one that is, I'm curious if any of this work has allowed community to drive or revise the research questions that academic bring forward. So that's the intention, that once we have the advisory group that will review proposals, we'll be able to provide recommendations on the research questions. The advisory group will also be available to consult with researchers before they want to submit the proposals. So if they would like to work with the advisory prior to learn about what are some things that the community would like to do research on, or what are some gaps in terms of research, because there's a couple hot topics that, there's been research that's been done again and again, right? And that's one of the other reasons we want the collections. That way people can see what research has been done and can either build on that work, but also differentiate. So we're not replicating that same research. So the intention is that that advisory group will be able to connect with researchers. So if you'd like to connect prior to submitting your proposal, we love that. If you just want to connect when you submit your proposal to us, before you submit it to the ethics board at your institution, you can do that as well, and we can provide some feedback on your research question, or even like your outreach methods, your methodology, those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I think that question was sent to me as well. So it sounds like it was also sent to you. Okay, are there other questions in your list?
No.
No, okay. I guess there's a follow-up. I'm wondering about the role of the university in the partnership. Sounds like the focus is on buy-in to the process, but that most of the work is truly driven by and held in the community. But I wonder how that power dynamic is managed. Also by Amanda.
Yeah, so that is 100% the way that it's kind of been done. So we have a lot of really great collaborations with the university. Like the libraries have been working really intensely with us to help us develop that collections. And we had no clue what open access was or Creative Commons and all of these things were. So there's a couple people at York who have been really collaborating with us to help us create this work. But the work is really grounded in the community. And so one of the ways that the university has kind of been supportive of this work is the ethics department at York has agreed to kind of change their proposal to include an additional question that says, is your research geographically specific to a community? And if you indicate that it is, it'll redirect you, or it'll say, have you made due effort to consult with that community's advisory board? And then it'll allow you to redirect to a website. Right now, I know we only have ours, but hopefully in the future, there'll be other communities that have similar processes. So the ethics department at York is actually going to make awareness about our group just through the application process, which is really great. Again, our advisory group is not mandatory. It's just something that is suggested. But yes, that buy-in piece is huge. So Shenali and I have been doing a lot of presentations like this to research methods courses at York. So getting that buy-in from profs at York very early on to acknowledge our existence, but also really commit to making sure that we're using this framework, again, because we're not mandatory. It is based on a lot of buy-in from both the community and the university.
Okay. A question from Tamasha. Are other universities going to be involved as U of T and Ryerson also do research in our community?
Yes, so the intention is for anybody doing research in the community. We're starting with York because we're a pretty small team. There's about 4 of us who are working on this project. And we're starting with York because we have those relationships at York. But the intention is to solidify the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership within the community so that no matter who it is, if you're from Ryerson, from U of T, if you come into the community and you're like, I'm planning to do this research, people will be able to say, okay, have you consulted with the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership? And we're seeing that that's already working. It's working a little bit too fast for us because we've been getting a lot of people submitting their research proposals and we don't even have an advisory yet. But we're seeing that a lot of community residents are really redirecting people to us. The Jane Finch Center has been doing a really great job of once folks approach them for research, they're saying, okay, have you touched base with the Jane Finch Research Partnership? And it's not just institutions, right? We're looking for the city of Toronto does a lot of research within the community and actually reached out to us last week about a project that they're doing. Wellesley Institute, any research institution, not just universities, we're looking to make sure that they go through this process as well.
Okay, one earlier, I think the person may have left, Elizabeth. I don't know if they're still in the, but they represent Seneca College, Yorkgate campus, especially the academic upgrading program that is a major source of referrals to literacy programs in the community. I don't know how our institution relates to the goals of this partnership. Up to 2018, we had a close and ongoing relationship with the community and many of the nonprofits, and we still play a role in providing access to post-secondary education. However, we are involved in delivering practical services to the community and not sociological research. Is there any sort of connection you can make with Seneca for those kinds of types of projects?
Yeah, no, and I think, well, my full-time job is actually at the Community Engagement Center, which is connected to that Seneca campus. So I'm right next door when I'm actually at work. But in terms of ways that we can kind of build that connection with Jane Finch Community Research Partnership, I think that the modules, I know a lot of people are hoping to adapt and use the modules as just a training resources. So a lot of the nonprofits are hoping to use those modules as an introduction for their new staff, right? Because we're talking about things like the history of Jane Finch, activism in the community, that can be applicable there, right? So if those modules are things that you'd like to show your students, I know the Seneca campus at Yorkgate gets a lot of residents from the Jane Finch community. So even getting them connected into the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership, I think there's definitely lots of different ways to work together to build on those pieces. But I also know a lot of the kids at Seneca, or a lot of the folks at Seneca, do placements in the community. And a lot of our placement students, we just started running something called the Jane Finch Placement Orientation, which is an orientation for all placement students that are coming into the community. So that might also be a good resource as well.
Okay, I don't see any questions. And another question from Amanda. Are you affiliated with JFAAP? Can you let us know what that stands for?
It's JPAPP, Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. Yes,
Okay.
JPAPP is super involved in our process. They are amazing. They do incredible work. And a couple key members from JPAPP are also at our table and are either facilitating modules or who have JPAPP. And I mean, it's so hard because the residents of JPAPP are just so engaged in so much different things, but they're very, those key people. There are a lot of people at that table who are at our table as well. And our intention is to work with JPAPP to make sure that this knowledge gets out there and that we're building relationships, because JPAPP is one of those grassroots organizations that gets asked like probably at least 3 times a week to do research. Like researchers love doing research on JPAPP or connecting with them. So they are one of the organizations that was actually like, we need to do something. We need to have our own advisory board, but they're very involved in this process as well.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions? If I may ask a question about the advisory committee, so it hasn't been set up yet. How are you going to ensure broad representation on that committee?
Yeah, so that's something that we're still working through. Once we're finished doing the modules, we're going to reconvene the meeting with community members to really think about that. We need to establish how many community members need to be on that advisory, how much York University staff are going to be on there, like what are the places or the placeholders for each of the people that are going to be on there. And then as I talked about earlier, Jane Finch is so diverse. So even if we have residents, are we making sure that those residents are capturing the different perspectives? Are we having a youth? Are we having a senior? Are we making sure we're capturing all of those different things? So we haven't quite gotten there yet. We know it's going to be a process. It'll probably take a couple meetings just for us to establish the makeup of the advisory. But once we establish the makeup, we're going to do a call out to the community. So basically a wide call out to get people involved, see who's interested. And then we're hoping that it'll be terms so people can get involved for, again, we haven't established it, but 1 or 2 terms, and then we'll be able to re-elect or whatever our process is for getting new faces in on that table to make sure that we're having as much different folks and as much different perspectives as we can.
Okay. Okay. I don't see any further questions. Do you have questions in your chat? So it looks like that people cannot send their questions to everyone, that they're only allowed to do private. Still trying to figure out.
Do you have any questions? No, you're good.
No, I don't have any questions on my end.
Okay. If there are no further questions, do you want to make any sort of final comments? And maybe we can post up your contact details on the YouTube description and the YouTube channel. But okay, if there are no further questions, thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak with us today and to share this important initiative.
Yeah, thank you. And Shenali, do you have any final comments? Shenali's been working on this project for like 8 months now, and she's just kind of excelled and has taken on a lot of the different things. So I don't know if you have any last words.
I don't have much to say. Thank you for letting us present to you guys. It was a pleasure. As well as our contact was up on the screen. I don't know if I think it'll be sent out later. If you guys have any further questions or comments, feel free to reach out. We'll definitely get back to you.